Hi, welcome to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone. Well, I've finally been to see the brand new movie adaptation of the Stephen King novel, It. And in this episode, what I want to do is I want to break down the film in a bit more detail and explain what I think was good about this movie and what I think was not so good about this film. In a nutshell, though, before I get into the details, which means there's going to be lots of spoilers in this episode, here's my basic summary of what I think about this movie. In a nutshell, I think it was good, but I don't think it's great, and I actually think it's being overhyped. I think that it doesn't live up to some of the hype that I have seen people writing and saying about this particular film. And there's a couple of reasons why I think it's being overhyped. Firstly, for a lot of people, this was a big part of their childhood growing up. The TV miniseries version of It was a big deal for a lot of people, and so it's a big nostalgia milestone for a lot of people. And so if you've got something that's got that level of nostalgia and an appeal to nostalgia, it's always going to be received a lot more fondly, and people are probably less likely to look objectively at the final product. On top of that, this was also a version of It that was far superior to that original TV miniseries version. It is, by a country mile, this film is just, it's far superior in just about every way to the original. And so when that happens, you've got a piece that has strong nostalgia appeal and the new version is just far better than the original, then people really are going to love this thing and perhaps not be so dispassionate and clear-headed in the way they look at this film. On top of that, this was also the subject of a really, really good marketing campaign. There's no doubting that this was probably one of the better movie marketing campaigns that we've seen in a long time. And so all of that, once again, adds to the hype of this film, and they were very clever in the way they marketed it. It's a nostalgia piece that is better than the original in a nutshell, but I don't think that this is a great movie, and I certainly don't think it is the best Stephen King adaptation ever put to film, as I've seen some people suggesting. I would actually rate it a bit further down the list than that. At the end of this episode, I'll explain where I put it on the list and what movies I think are ahead of it. So let's get into the details though. And first thing I want to do is I want to start by exploring what I really liked about this movie adaptation of It. The first thing I really loved about It was the fact that it didn't actually overdo the 80s nostalgia. There's enough of it there to sort of establish that yes, this is set in the 1980s, but they didn't really go too far. There's not Star Wars toys and posters everywhere, and they really could have gone overboard, but they didn't, and I appreciated the fact that they sort of kept that stuff in check. There's one little reference which I would question though. It was funny because I'm someone from that era, and interestingly enough, I'm about the same age as as you would say, the children in this film are. I was probably a couple of years older than they were, and at the same time this film takes place, 88 and 89. I would have been a couple of years ahead of them in school, but that is sort of my era. So I remember what it was like growing up in that era, and the one reference that I found a little bit jarring was the Molly Ringwald comment. I'm not convinced necessarily that kids of that age at that stage of the 1980s would have been referencing Molly Ringwald in that way. Her big claim to fame, The Breakfast Club and 16 Candles, they had been sort of 4 or 5 years previous, or three to 5 years previous. And also, when you think about the age of those children, they would have been, about 7, 8, 9 years old when that was happening. And so it's sort of, I don't think in 88, 89 they would have been referencing Molly Ringwald, but it's not the end of the world, and it is kind of forgivable because really it's a nod to us, the audience, those of us who are around in that era and remember Molly Ringwald. It really is it's an anchor point for locking this film again into the 80s. I really love the orchestral score in this. I love the fact that they used a symphonic score, if you like, a strings-based orchestral score. I really love orchestral scores. I think the big temptation here would have been to go with perhaps an 80s synth type score. It certainly worked really well for the Netflix series Stranger Things, but in this film it wouldn't have been a good choice, I don't think, and so I'm glad they avoided that. I always find that an orchestral score tends to keep a movie more timeless. You go back to a film and you watch it and you realise it's not locked into a particular time period. The other thing I really liked was the fact that some of the visuals in this they're really quite impressive, some of the visuals that you see. That whole bathroom scene with the blood and everything else, I think I couldn't help but sense there's a bit of a homage going on there to Stanley Kubrick's version of The Shining, just the colouring of the bathroom and the way that sort of all unfolds. And there's other stuff as well. There's some nice little visuals in this film that are definitely praiseworthy. The child acting, there's some moments of child acting which are pretty good in this film. And overall, it's passable, but it's not great. And I'm going to talk about in a moment when I talk about the things I didn't like about this film and where I think it does deserve some criticism. There are moments of child acting that are not so good. But on the flip side, there are actually some moments of child acting that are good. And overall, it is passable. As I said, there's one or two moments that you sort of think, oh, maybe. But generally speaking, the child acting is okay, certainly passable. And there's some pretty good moments in there as well. I love the fact that there was no Stephen King cameo in this movie, or none that I saw. Maybe I missed it, so if I missed it, please let me know in the comment section below. But if I did miss it, it means that it was more of a subtle cameo, and that's a great thing. I think in this movie, it just would have felt a bit cheesy and corny and a little bit out of place. It would have been too much of a nod to the audience. There's already plenty of nods in there, and I think it just would have been too much of a nod to the audience if all of a sudden you pulled out of the film and it's like, hey, look! It's Stephen King, you know, the guy who wrote this. We all know he wrote this. This is him. Look, 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 it's him. So I'm glad they didn't do that. And lastly, I think Pennywise the clown I think Pennywise is really the strength of this. There's some choices around the way in which they've chosen to present Pennywise with the big blaring horn blast and other things that I didn't necessarily like. And there are some things about Pennywise that I'm going to question in the next part of this video. But I think the makeup was phenomenal, the acting was phenomenal, the way that the character is presented and played, I think is really good. It is the strength of this. And when you think about it, Pennywise actually has to work. If Pennywise doesn't work, this whole movie falls over. It really does depend on Pennywise being a strong and pivotal linchpin of this movie. He's sort of the rock on which the whole thing has to take place. And if he hadn't have worked, then they would have been in real trouble. And they've got Pennywise to work really well. So you can't fault the acting and the portrayal of Pennywise, and some of the makeup and the visuals around Pennywise were just great. But not everything about this movie is sunshine and roses, and this is why I think that it's not a great film, and I think it's being overhyped by some people. So let's look at some of the negatives now. First of all, the child acting, while most of it is passable and there's some moments that are definitely right up there, there's also some moments that are not so good, and they stick out a little bit in the film, and they're a bit lacking. Now, if you want to see a good example, consistently good example of child acting from a director, watch James Mangold's films. The child acting in Walk the Line, the child acting in Logan, the child acting in 3:10 to Yuma. It's all really, really solid. And there's a reason why, because child acting is obviously a different beast to when you've got older actors on screen. And a lot of it requires not just the coaching that the actors themselves, because they're a bit younger, are receiving from the experts in acting, but also the direction they're receiving from the director and the way the director is choosing to select their shots and place the camera. It really does make a difference, because often what you find with child actors, or certainly this would be something I would see consistently in things that involve children, is children are not as strong as older actors are at holding their character. So they might be able to deliver a line really well, but often, apart from that very sort of small number of really great child actors, they tend to slip out of character, or they start giving knowing glances, or they break the fourth wall. And so what happens is you need to be careful about how you use child actors and the direction you give them and the way you shoot them. And a couple of times in this film, there's some sort of bigger, wider shots of the group, and you sort of just get the sense a little bit, well, I did anyway, the character was broken a little bit, or the lines weren't delivered as well as they could have been. And so I think the child acting in places was lacking, but there was also some greatness in there. It's not all bad. And I think perhaps part of it might be, I think another commentator I saw talking about this recently suggested that perhaps part of it is also the dialogue they're working with. Stephen King writes a particular sort of style of dialogue, which, you know, perhaps is a little bit harder to get right when you're trying to place the movie in the 1980s, particularly for child actors. The other thing that I found a bit frustrating was the constant wisecracking got a little bit testing at times. Obviously it has its place in this type of film. You know, you understand why you've got this whole young childhood bravado, braggadocio, you know, wisecracking stuff going on. They're establishing these sort of cheeky young scamps and their childhood adventures and all the rest of it. But towards the end, when it starts cropping up, there are a couple of times towards the end of the film and it just pops up again and you're thinking, oh, that was a bit out of place. It was okay in the beginning, but to have the wisecrack here, it just sort of doesn't quite work. And it sort of pulls you out of the film, and it doesn't work at either level. It doesn't really have the same comedic effect that it would if the situation wasn't so serious. And it also sort of pulls you out of the seriousness of the situation the children are actually facing at that particular stage. One thing that really stuck out to me that I didn't like was the sexualization of Bev and her relationship with the boys in this story. Now, yes, I know the novel adaptation has a graphic child sex scene in it. And I don't know what was going through Stephen King's mind or whatever issues he has, but that is one of the big problems with the novel. And I'm personally really big on this issue. I think that child sexualization has no place in art at all. I think that if you are talking about a documentary or a film which is highlighting real events, then there is a way in which these issues might have to be touched upon and utilised in certain films. But in a totally fictional sort of what you might call horror fantasy type story like this, I just think that it's exploitative, and I think children deserve better than this. And I really think that there's something really important about fencing off childhood so that young people are not dragged into adulthood prematurely and that they're not sexualized. It's very exploitative. I don't think it's healthy or good for society either to have art that is sort of constantly sexualizing children. And I just think it puts them in a position of vulnerability and doesn't really respect children as it should. Now, the other reason it's really frustrating in this film is because it doesn't really start out as a sort of hyper-sexualized thing either. It starts out with more of an innocence to it. Like when she's signing that yearbook, he's got this sort of doe-eyed crush about him. He's just sort of googly-eyed over this girl, like young kids were and tend to be at that age. But then when they move it into the whole, particularly that scene where they go swimming at the reservoir, and I remember just thinking to myself, this just doesn't feel good. It just feels exploitative. She has become this child sexual object for the boys, and it's really problematic because her character in this story is someone who has suffered obviously horrific sexual abuse. And so to sort of have her being objectified by the boys in that way as well, I think it actually undermines the story. Now, I get it. Stephen King wrote his story a certain way, but this is a movie adaptation, and it means you have the freedom to adapt certain elements of the story and to improve them. And here's how I think the story could be improved. Imagine if they had have maintained a relationship between Bev and the rest of the boys that was actually more innocent. And it was like the worst it got to was a sort of childhood crush. You know, you would have set up everything you need for the second film, and at the same time, you would have had a clear demarcation, a clear point of difference between the relationship she has with the other men and people in her life who treat her as a sexual object. Her own father just objectifies her and treats her as an object for his own gratification. But the boys, it would have been different if they had kept it at more of a crush / childhood friendship level. And I think it would have strengthened it. All of a sudden, you would have realized there's sort of a purity to the relationship they share, which would have really strengthened their ability to actually fight back against the evil of it and Pennywise. I think also it would have strengthened the fact that these boys were treating her like no one else does. They were treating her as an equal. They were giving her something she desperately needed and didn't have, which was family. And in family, you love other people for who they are. You don't treat them as objects for your own gratification. And I just think that that was a really weak part of the story, and I think the film could have done without it, and it would have been stronger if they had gone in the other direction. Another thing that I didn't like about this film is I think it's too long. I think part of the problem here, why it's actually too long, is because there's a lot of unnecessary padding in this movie that just doesn't serve the plot. The basic rule of storytelling, particularly when you are making films, is that what you put on screen should be at service of the plot. It should advance the plot in some real and concrete way. It should set something up that's going to pay off later, or it should be a moment of character development. You know, you're learning something about the characters by what you see unfolding on screen. But there are things in this film that don't really adhere to any of those rules and actually are a distraction, and I think they pad out the film in ways that are not so good, and they make it too long. I think it could have been a lot tighter. Because by and large, that sort of final crescendo of the film was actually pretty good. But some of the lead up getting us there was I think a bit problematic. So, for example, the role that the bullies played in this film adaptation, I think that whole subplot with the bully and his father and the killing of his father and then coming after the gang, I think it was just absolutely pointless. Here's how I would have used those bullies. I would have had them in the film, but what I would have done is I would have used them initially to show the fact that these young kids are actually the outsiders, the outcasts, that they are picked on, that they're often the victims of bullying at the hands of others. So it sort of establishes a reason why they might stand up to certain things. You would also use it as a catalyst. The bullies would be a catalyst to actually bring this group of kids together. So the bullies become the threat. And this does happen, but it could have been a lot tighter, I think. Where this group of friends are brought together because they share a common enemy. And by and large, the film, is not too bad at that particular point. You would also use the bullies, that one particular bully who gets taken by Pennywise down in the sewers. That's a great moment, and what that does is that you're using this bully, this ancillary character that you don't really need to be around for too long or to do too much else. You're using him as a catalyst to advance the plot and to show you something important, that the sewers are a dangerous place to be and that kids are obviously going missing. And then the other thing you'd do is I think you would use the bullies as a catalyst, and they would be an effective catalyst for actually speeding up the plot or causing things to happen that wouldn't necessarily make sense otherwise. So for example, there's one scene where you have that scene where the zombie leper appears out of nowhere, and you have this character rushes into the well house, round the back of the well house, and he encounters Pennywise there. Now that scene would have made a lot more sense, I think, if you didn't need to have the zombie leper. What they could have done was had him all of a sudden look up and realise that the bullies were coming towards him at the end of the street, and we've already established that they are petrified of these bullies. He's got nowhere else to go, and so he has no choice but to run into the backyard of the well house. And that to me would have been a better, more organic and more authentically good way of telling that sort of moment of the story and presenting that particular thing. So that's how you use the bullies. But to have this whole subplot with the bully and his father, it's obviously clear that he's got a troubled home life. And it just made no sense very late in the piece too, to bring the sheriff in just for that brief moment where he suddenly becomes this ultra-violent dad and he's a threat to his kid. And it's sort of like it comes out of nowhere. And there's no real purpose or point to it. And then to have that bully under the control of Pennywise who tells him to go on a killing spree, again, it serves no real purpose. Now, yes, I get it. He turns up when they're in the well house and he attacks one of the characters, and that results in that ammunition belt of cartridges for the bolt gun being dropped down the well. But you didn't need the bully to achieve any of that. All you needed, and I think it would have been much better, it would have been much less Deus Ex Machina than what it was in this film, would have been to actually have that ammunition belt slip off his shoulder as he was going down the rope. If he just sort of dropped a little bit on the rope and the ammunition belt had just slid right off, or it hadn't been tied on properly and it dropped off, that would have been a much better way, again, of telling that story point. And you wouldn't need to pad the film out with that whole extra subplot. When you think about it, that subplot was absolutely pointless. It did not go anywhere, and it did not advance the plot in any significant or real or tangible kind of way. It was just very weak and minor things you didn't need it for. It's generally, I think, a little bit weak on the storytelling side of things as well. The rules, for example, of Pennywise I'm at the other side of this. I'm still not 100% clear on what the rules were of Pennywise in this particular adaptation. Yes, obviously he plays on the fear of his victims, but that little boy, the young brother, at the very beginning of the film, he wasn't scared of Pennywise. So I don't understand why you would introduce this whole thing of playing on fear and trying to scare people and how he feeds off it, even though the very first moment we encounter him in this film, the boy's not scared, and yet still he does what he's going to do to him. Also in that sequence, he bit his arm off, and I kind of didn't understand why that happened, because he doesn't appear to be eating the kids, right? He is, he's certainly not, it's not like a regular feast he's having on these. It's not like McDonald's takeout or anything. Quick, grab me a kid, I'm hungry. There's a whole process and a hibernation thing, and he's pulling these kids into his hive. And it's sort of strange that he just bite the arm off one kid. Maybe it's explainable. I don't know. Maybe he's been hungry for a while, and he's just sort of a bit desperate. But none of that was really sort of presented in the film. And so it sort of seemed a little bit strange and inconsistent with how he acts throughout the rest of the film. The other thing too is the way in which he sort of appears in scenes and then doesn't do anything. It's just like he's there to scare them but not exploit that scare. If he feeds off the fear, why doesn't he go the whole hog? Why is the whole dream thing happening with Pennywise? Is that Pennywise or is that the kids? Like it appears to be in the film that this is actually Pennywise who's doing all this stuff, but it sort of just isn't quite clear what the mechanisms and the rules are of Pennywise as a monster and as a threat. They just seem a little bit vague and ambiguous and possibly even a little bit contradictory. So it would have been good if they'd sort of cleared that up a little bit. And I think the other thing too is that they showed Pennywise too early in this film. I think they gave away Pennywise. I think they gave away too much too soon. And I think it would have been better to actually build up some more atmosphere first. And that brings me to my last point. I think that this film lacked some really essential atmosphere. The atmosphere of tension and fear and horror. And this is a big part of what Stephen King does. You sort of get the sense of the walls are closing in on you. There's a threat. And there's sort of like at the very beginning, usually of his stories, there's a small window of opportunity with which you can escape or address the threat. But what happens is things just multiply and multiply and multiply, and problem upon problem is added, and mistake upon mistake, and the thing becomes more powerful and grows. And what happens is the walls start to close in on you, and your ability to escape is completely eroded, and then all of a sudden you have to have a big confrontation. And it's great. The storytelling is a storytelling device that works well, but in this film it just sort of felt a little bit like it was lacking. It just sort of felt like what they needed was much more of an establishment of the lore around this town, this 27-year cycle of kids going missing, which clearly, as we're told in the film, this is a much higher rate of child disappearance than the national averages for the rest of the country. So why has no one by the late 1980s noticed this? Why is this town still so heavily populated, it seems, with families, when clearly this would probably be one of the places you wouldn't want to live as a family? And I think the way that you could actually make this work better is if you gave this town more of a recession feel. So perhaps it had some industry that had moved out of town, and the people who were stuck there, they were stuck there, and that's why they were there. They couldn't go anywhere else. Perhaps there was a bit more poverty in this town, and people are sort of trapped. And so they've got this evil, but they've got no other way of getting away from it. And I think it really would have added to the tension. It just feels a bit like this menace should be more present. It should be more talked about. It should be more known about in the town. Or perhaps there should be some crazy, kooky adults who talk about the 27-year evil menace and have crazy theories about what's really going on. And sort of none of that's present in this film. And so it just doesn't have the sort of claustrophobic menace that I think it really should have had. I think part of the issue perhaps is the fact that they've centered this version of the story in the 80s, and I think perhaps it would have actually been better suited if they'd set it in the 50s. And I think you could, perhaps 50s and 60s maybe, you just could have done a bit more with the atmosphere of the town and a few other things to actually make it play out a bit better. And so I think it just sort of lacked that atmosphere. So there you go, that's my thoughts on the movie It. In a nutshell, I think it's a good film, but I don't think it's a great film, and there's certainly some things that could have been done a lot better. In many ways, I think this film is, for me, kind of feels a bit like Super 8 did when it first came out. When Super 8 was first released, there was a lot of hype about that film, and everyone loved it, and it certainly was like a sort of nostalgia piece. It played on so many of the things we loved about our childhoods, and it received a lot of acclaim when it was first released. But now, once the heat has died down a little bit on that movie now, people sort of look back on it and they're like, yeah, it was okay. It's not a great film, but it's a good film. It's an enjoyable film to watch, but it's not great. It's not excellence in filmmaking. And it's certainly not what I think, as some people have tried to suggest, is that it's the best Stephen King adaptation ever put to film. I just don't think that is true at all. As far as I'm concerned, I would probably put it at number 6, 7, maybe even number 8 on the list of Stephen King adaptations. For me, right up there at the very top, depending on whether you go for one style or another, I think the 2 top Stephen King adaptations that we've ever seen are The Shawshank Redemption and The Shining. And I think, once again, this is sort of perhaps a genre thing, and how you approach the question of what is great filmmaking. Stanley Kubrick really is more of a visualist. He takes a story and he visually interprets it in all sorts of, really quite amazing ways. Frank Darabont with The Shawshank Redemption is more classic storytelling. It's like the complete classic story, full of archetypes and a beautiful score and well shot and everything else. It's just a great period piece. So I put Shawshank Redemption at the top of my list because I think Shawshank Redemption is a great film because I think storytelling actually matters most and makes makes filmmaking more accessible to more people. And so I put Shawshank Redemption ahead. However, I know there are some people who might put The Shining ahead because they prefer the sort of visual aspect of filmmaking. Either way, those two films are better. Stand By Me is better. It certainly does a better job, I think, of creating this group of childhood friends and the sort of adventures and experiences they have. I think it does that better. Misery, I think, is a better adaptation. Carrie is a better adaptation. The Green Mile, I think, is a better adaptation. Then, after all of those films, I would then put It. And for me, it's a sort of toss-up between It and Frank Darabont's version of The Mist. I probably favour The Mist a little bit, although I'd be willing to put them on a par with each other as far as, the quality of the actual adaptation goes of a Stephen King property. I think the reason I put The Mist ahead is because of the fact that The Mist took the Stephen King property and added and adapted the story for film and added something that made it even better, and that was the final ending. Stephen King didn't write that final ending of The Mist. And he said later on, I saw him in an interview where he said that he wished he'd thought of that ending that Frank Darabont came up with and adapted the film in that way. And so for that reason, I would put it ahead of this new version of It. But I know for some people they'd put It above The Mist probably because It certainly has that sort of bigger budget feel and there's a bit more to it. Perhaps in that regard, there's sort of a bit more flash to it, whereas The Mist is more of made on a bit more of a budget, and it's sort of a cut down and really tightly focused sort of character piece. So there you go. That's my thoughts on the new adaptation of It. I would love to hear your thoughts. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Are there things that I missed that were really good about this film? Are there things that I missed that were not so good about this film and deserve criticism? I'd love to know your thoughts. Have you seen it? Was it overhyped? Or was it a great film? Let me know in the comments section below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time on Left Foot Media.